Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really encouraged to see all the interest here in Iceland, and our hope is that we can leave with a more open environment to try to start MDMA research and other research here in Iceland. So I'm going to talk to you about the path to FDA approval and then our globalization. But I'd like to start by saying why MDMA and why PTSD? So this was a strategic decision made 36 years ago. And I felt that it was important to try to look at which psychedelic would be most likely to make it through the system first, and then paired it with what clinical condition. And I had seen MDMA be very revitalizing the therapeutic community from the middle 70s to the early 80s. I learned about MDMA in '82 when it was both used as a therapy drug. It was legal at the time. It was called Adam, but it was also being used in a recreational setting under the name ecstasy. And so it was clear that the legal status of it was doomed. This was during Nancy Reagan, Just Say No, and the fact that ecstasy was being used in a public setting would mean that it was going to be attracting the attention of the Drug Enforcement Administration, and its time as a legal therapy drug was limited. But we knew about the fact that the DEA was going to find out about it, but they did not know about the therapeutic use. So they only knew about the recreational use. So we had several years to prepare to try to protect MDMA. But MDMA is the most gentle of all the psychedelics. It's the easiest to integrate, it's the least ego dissolution, it's the most uniformly positive, not always, but and one of the most important parts of trying to bring a psychedelic into more widespread acceptance is that we feel that the therapists and psychiatrists who are going to be working with it would be more effective if they have tried the drug themselves. I mean, you wouldn't go to a yoga teacher who doesn't do yoga, or a meditation teacher who doesn't meditate. And we felt that there's going to be a lot more fear and resistance among psychiatrists and psychotherapists to volunteering for psilocybin or for LSD than there would be if they would be open to MDMA. So for all those reasons, we felt that MDMA would be the drug that would most likely make it through the regulatory system first. But then we had to figure out what is it that it would be used for. And in 1984, I had an opportunity to work with a PTSD patient who was suicidal, who had been in an institution. She had actually, this is a cautionary tale, it's really important to say this, that I'd actually sold MDMA to a friend of mine who had done it with his girlfriend. And during this MDMA experience, I didn't know her at all, but during this MDMA experience, memories of past rape and almost murder had arisen. And she had been in and out of mental institutions before. She had been treated by psychiatrists before. And during this MDMA experience, they had intended to this be a romantic experience, but this trauma had come to the surface. And it was so strong that they couldn't contain it. They weren't able to do it. And she felt that she needed to check herself into a mental institution to avoid hurting herself, to avoid committing suicide. And after she was stabilized for around 6 days or so, she got out of the institution and was given the same SSRIs, and she was hopeless. She knew that this was not going to help her. It hadn't helped her before. And so my friend said to me, "Can you work with her?" And I felt like I'm not qualified. I'm just learning to be a therapist. But she had no other options. So I thought, okay, I will try to work with her. I contacted her on the telephone, and I said, if you promise not to commit suicide while we're working together, I'll give it a try. And so she agreed to do that. And then I saw her get better. And it was just astonishing how much she got better. So I knew then that MDMA was tremendous for PTSD. Now, we also needed a clinical condition that would be suffered by people that would be appreciated by the society. And there was a lot, at this point, there was a lot of Vietnam veterans that had still had PTSD. So in America, we have the veterans on a pedestal in many different ways. And so we needed a condition that was very serious, that was very expensive if it wasn't treated, that it could lead to suicide, that it could lead to disabilities, that it would cost insurance companies a lot of money, and again, that we would have sympathetic patients, not just veterans, but also women who'd been sexually abused or assaulted. So that became this idea of MDMA for post-traumatic stress, that was the strategic idea of this would be the way that we would try to bring psychedelics back. And so over the 36 years then that I started MAPS, there was a nonprofit before MAPS that we used to sue the DEA to try to keep MDMA legal as a therapy drug. Once in 1984, they moved to try to criminalize it. And we ended up winning the legal case, but the Drug Enforcement Administration decided not to listen to the judge and criminalized MDMA. So both therapeutic use and recreational use. We took them totally by surprise. They had no idea that it was used by the therapists, and we had introduced it to a wide range of people, including religious leaders. And so MDMA is tremendous in half doses for meditation. And so Brother David Steindl-Rast, who was a Roman Catholic monk, kind of an ecumenical monk, had used it in the monastery to meditate. Rabbi Zalman Schachter, a Jewish renewal expert rabbi who'd compared MDMA to the Sabbath. So when the legal cases took place, we had monks and rabbis and psychiatrists from Harvard Medical School and all over testifying and patients. So we were able to really win in the courts and win in the court of public opinion, but in the end we lost. And then it was clear that we needed to go through the FDA. So MAPS was started in '86, and since then we've raised about $140 million in donations or grants. But we've now seen the rise of the for-profit psychedelic companies, and it's been more difficult for us to raise all the money from philanthropy. A lot of the people who were philanthropists were like, well, now we'd rather invest, and maybe that's the way you should go. So we have gotten $43 million in a revenue share, which is not ownership, not stock, and we're getting a $20 million loan. So at this moment, MAPS is the sole owner of the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. And so in 2014, we started the Public Benefit Corporation, and we want to innovate in two different ways. The first way to innovate is psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. The second way is, how do we market a pharmaceutical drug? I think in America in particular, where we don't have national health care, the profit motive has warped healthcare out of all common sense. And so we have the highest per capita expenditures on healthcare, but we have the outcomes around 40 or 50 among the countries, because there's so much money is being taken by insurance companies, by other profit-seeking entities. So what we wanted to do is create the Public Benefit Corporation as our pharmaceutical arm. And it's a modification of capitalism. There's now thousands of these public benefit corporations. And what's unique about them is that in the traditional corporation, what you need to do is maximize profits. And if the shareholders decide that the management is not maximizing profits, they can try to displace them. They'll have shareholder lawsuits, and they will try to put new management there that will maximize profits. But in a public benefit corporation, you put the public benefit over profit. And that's the way that we want, and that's what I think healthcare in general should go to. So right now the Public Benefit Corp is wholly owned by the nonprofit MAPS, and we're hoping now that we will be able to sustain that through philanthropy. That's going to be a challenge for us because of the large sums of money we need to move through to commercialization, patient access, and to what we're calling a sustainability point, where income from the sale of MDMA, if FDA approves it, covers all of our expenses. So this is our current situation right now. This is a beautiful graphic. I'll get out of the way of it. This is from Alex Gray, and this is the interpretation of the MAPS logo and how he described this. One hand releases a magical pill, radiant with the potential of psychological and spiritual well-being. One hand needing healing is outstretched, reaching hopefully for relief that can cure the soul and help cure a world of distressed souls The rainbow emanation of spheres relates to the Tibetan context of Tegal, translated as an essential spark, drop of primordial potential, the spark of life. Now, this was his interpretation of the MAPS logo, which you can see is over here. And the reason that the hands are in front of the psychedelic swirl in the background is to make the point that it's about therapy. The treatment is not the drug. As I told you about the first situation with Marcela, the woman that I worked with in 1984, that MDMA can cause problems. It's not inherently therapeutic if it's not contained in a therapeutic relationship. So the logo is a way for us to tell the story that what's most important is the human relationship and the therapeutic context. And within that, the psychedelic can be helpful. Now, this is something that I think speaks to the sense of urgency that we have. This was kind of a shock for me to receive a few months ago with this image of the MAPS logo on a tombstone. And the story was about a soldier from Denmark who had been in Afghanistan and that had gotten PTSD. And when he came back, he was suffering a lot from PTSD, and he was able to find an underground therapist that gave him 2 MDMA sessions that helped him a lot to sort of come back to life. But then his therapist felt that he shouldn't do this any illegal thing anymore. And in order to get government support, he had to give it up as well. So he gave up. He felt that he could no longer do the MDMA. And over time, he got all these other treatments, but his PTSD got worse and worse and worse, and eventually he committed suicide. And so then Kim's mother, Annie, put the MAPS logo on the tombstone. And so what that shows is that also it's not you need follow-up, you need aftercare. It's not that you can have necessarily 1 or 2 MDMA sessions, everything's fine. You need to keep at it sometimes. And so this, I think, just points to the fact that there are so many people that are suffering. We need to go as fast as we can, but not too fast. We need to acknowledge the fears that there are, and we need to move as carefully as we can as well. So what does our therapy look like? The essence of the therapy is this therapeutic alliance, and that's found in therapeutic research of all kinds, is that the trust between the patient and the therapist is the most important factor to create a safe context for people to bring out things that are difficult for them. And that's more important of a factor than what kind of therapy it is. So the therapeutic alliance, we emphasize building this empathic rapport to support the participants' healing process. The second part is really key. The direction of the session is sourced from the participant's experience. We all know that if we hurt our body and scratch it or break something or something, there's a healing return to wholeness, energies in our body. And that's below our level of conscious awareness. And so the theory that we have, the hypothesis is that there is an inner healing intelligence for the psyche as well. And that it's a return to wholeness, but that there are things that are in the way. Sometimes pain is overwhelming, trauma, guilt, shame, as Eric was talking about. But the idea is that this inner healing intelligence will bring to the surface what people most need to pay attention to at the moment. And it's not automatically that they go to the trauma. They could go to a happy experience. They could build strength from that. But we support what's emerging. And we support it whether it's emerging in the mind as a story, in the body as a pain or energy, or however it's manifesting itself. And we support the expansion, the expression, and the release of it. So it sometimes looks like you're going, from a traditional psychiatric perspective, sometimes you're going in the wrong direction. You're not trying to suppress the symptoms. You're trying to bring the symptoms to the surface so that then they can be fully experienced, fully expressed, understood, resolved. So we trust this patient process, this inner healing intelligence, and we support whatever is emerging. And this, we call it inner-directed therapy, that everybody has this natural ability to heal and this intrinsic wisdom. And so the treatment manual, for those of you that are interested in learning about the therapeutic approach, we don't trademark it or anything like that. It's up on the website, maps.org treatment-manual. And you can see what the description of it is. So this is a manualized therapy. We have adherence raters that watch videotapes of the sessions, give feedback to the participants, manualized so that this was something that we could do research with, we could standardize the approach. And we have 3 basic elements of the training. The first is this 100-hour process that is mostly a little bit more online, but we've experimented during the pandemic with fully online, where we had one that was 300 people, one was 500 people, people from all over the world. And our trainers really felt that the training was not good enough to do it that way, that people weren't able to really fully ask their questions. It was harder for them to pay attention. We're showing videotapes of therapy sessions, and sometimes those are triggering for people, and we couldn't tell when. So we've gone now pretty much exclusively to in-person trainings that combines online with in-person. We will still experiment to see if we can do an online training. The second part is always going to be optional, and this is an opportunity for therapists to volunteer to receive MDMA themselves in a therapeutic setting. And we have had any number of therapists that have said that they had previously, like Ben Sessa when they were younger, had taken MDMA in recreational settings, but they say it feels like a different experience when they take it in a therapeutic setting, like a different drug. And so we've done surveys of the therapists, and they talk how important this is for them to be personally, but also professionally, for them to be sitters. So the average, more or less 8-hour session, about half the time people's eyes are closed, they're listening to music, they're having this inner experience, it's imaginative, it's it's hard for therapists sometimes to understand what's going on. The other half of the time, people are talking to the therapist. So we really want the therapist to understand from their own experience how much goes on after you've got MDMA when you're not even necessarily speaking to the therapist. And so we want the therapist to be quiet, empathic presence, but not interfere too much. So we will never make this mandatory. We don't think that we should require anybody to do a drug. This will always be optional. And what that means is we don't think that therapists who've done MDMA are somehow or other better than all the therapists who've never done MDMA. We just think that a therapist who has done MDMA is better and more effective than they themselves would be if they had never tried it. And then the challenge with that is that it's, again, the most labor-intensive part of it. We're doing that on an individual session. There is a potential to do group therapy to expose a group of therapists, but we're not wanting to do that initially because we're training people to work with individuals initially. So we want them to be the patient, in a sense, in an individual setting. And then the third part of it is that we will supervise therapists as they work with their first PTSD patient. And we'll have our adherence raters watch the videotapes and give feedback. And then if we feel that they need more attention, we'll supervise them on their second patient. But this is our program for treating therapists. And we've had multiple different cohorts here. Sarko, you've heard here, give a good question about being on the petition. The reason, there's several reasons. We've heard from Bia. She said that, in Brazil, they've learned to fear the police. I've often felt that the police are the predators and I'm the prey. But what my nephew is now a police officer, my sister's oldest child. And so the theme here and one of the core principles of MAPS is healing for all. We really need to work with everyone. And there was one, the Israeli psychiatrist, a traditional Israeli psychiatrist that we were going through the training program. And she asked a question that made us realize that we really had not fully explained what was the potential of MDMA. Her question was, she said, I finally understand. This is for the victims, but not for the perpetrators. And we're like, no, that's not it at all. I mean, it's sometimes harder to forgive yourself than it is to forgive somebody else. So this is for everyone, and most perpetrators are also victims themselves at different times. So even those labels are difficult. So it's been very important for me to try to move through my own fears and to reach out. And so I felt that one of the most important things that we've been trying to do is to develop bipartisan support and to show that this is really for all. When we talk about working potentially here in Iceland with the Minister of Justice, with reducing recidivism, we always say it should also be for the prison guards as well. You know, they're also, particularly in America, also traumatized. So this is about healing for all, and it's a very proud relationship that I've developed with Sarko, and Jerry, his chief, who's also here. And so I think in terms of educating people what we're doing, the fact that Sarko has been willing to not only go through the training, but to let his MDMA session be videotaped for use in How to Change Your Mind was a powerful symbol. We're saying this is not just for, you know, hippies from the 60s. This is really for everybody, and it's about healing for all. Now, when we talk about the therapies, we're really having to think about educating the regulatory agencies, because this is new to them. And the regulatory agencies regulate medicines, but they don't regulate psychotherapy. And so when we started with this with the FDA, in their early stages, first it was MDMA, and then a while later, then it comes along psilocybin. And so we had a sort of head start because we were focused all along on drug development from the beginning of MAPS. It was not academic research, it was drug development. And so when we got permission from FDA to go to phase 3, it was November 29th, 2016. The FDA said, yes, we could go to phase 3. And then we negotiated 8 months to be what the design of the study would be, what all of the other information they would want. And the model that we proposed was, it was a 2-person therapy team, male, female, but it's not always, it doesn't have to be that way. But we felt that it is the case that a lot of times people do have trauma from childhood, and the traditional model would be this male-female team. Again, doesn't always have to be. We've had 2 female teams, we've sometimes had 2 male teams. But it would be one where the first person is licensed to do therapy and the second person doesn't need a license. They could be a student to get a license, or they could be someone who has 1,000 hours behavioral health experience. So we'd like to keep the 2-person model, but the important point is that there will be pressures, economic pressures, from insurance companies and national health care, and so we feel that if we can have the 2-person model where the second person is not a licensed therapist, but the first person is, that might help us keep this 2-person model for individual therapy. And so the FDA said yes to that. And they also said yes to this idea that the doctor needs to do initial screening and needs to be on call during the MDMA session, but we don't need a doctor on site. And so that's how we were approved to go into phase 3 with this model. And we also then got permission from the FDA to give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. And the way we did that was, because we're training people for research, it was 4 days where they would get either MDMA or placebo in a double-blind way, and then a day of integration, and then the 3rd day would be the crossover, and then the 4th day would be the integration from that day. And so that was the model. But we wanted to make it less expensive, and as we're training more people for other kinds of research, we thought we would drop the placebo and the day of integration and just do the MDMA and the day of integration after that, with some prep and integration also. So we went to the FDA and we said, this is what we want to do. And the FDA, now, after we had gotten permission to move to phase 3, they started working with the psilocybin people, and they started realizing that this was coming. Psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy was coming, and they started getting nervous. Bureaucrats started getting nervous, and they started saying to the psilocybin people, well, you need MD PhD as the lead person, and you need a doctor on site. And they agreed to do that. They were more focused on academic medical centers than we were. We were more focused on where the therapists are actually working. You know, our operating principle was maximize therapeutic outcomes, And we don't feel that that's necessarily always the case in a medicalized center, and we don't think that MD PhDs are any better than licensed therapists. So the psilocybin people started agreeing this because they would have doctors on site in these facilities, and they were thinking more academic medicine. So then when we went to do this protocol to change to make it easier to train more therapists with MDMA, the FDA said no. We'll never give you permission for doing this. It's too risky to give to healthy volunteers like this, and we want MD PhD, and we want a physician on site. And we went back to our phase 3 data and our phase 2 data, and we showed them, look, here's all the sites that had MD PhD, here's the sites that didn't. There's no difference in efficacy. Here's the sites that had a doctor on site, here's ones that had a doctor on call, no difference in safety. And the FDA kept rejecting our arguments. And what we realized from that is that the FDA regulators, they didn't necessarily object to what we were doing, they just didn't want to take responsibility for the decision. And so it was like an invitation to sue them. And so we hired lawyers that are scientist lawyers, that experts in what is called formal dispute regulation request, formal disputes. And so formal dispute resolution requests. So we ended up spending over $250,000 on lawyers in order to make the case, and it went to the Office of Neuroscience over the Division of Psychiatry. And so, this was where we started out. It doesn't pass the risk-benefit. The lead person needs to be MD, PhD, and the physician needs to be on site. So in the end, we completely won on every single point. And the Office of Neuroscience did overrule the division. And what we were told turned out to be the case, that the division wasn't upset with us, that we had sort of called them to account for their superiors, that I think they just, as I said, didn't want to make the decision. And not only that, this has helped us, but this has helped the psilocybin people as well. So now there doesn't need to be an MD PhD as the lead for MDMA or for psilocybin, and there doesn't need to be a doctor on site. So this will, I think, these were poison pills for the entire field, and so we've knocked those out. So what that also means is that over time, we will be able to train people who are not licensed therapists to work under supervision of a licensed therapist. And if someone wants to be a student, to get a license, they can work on sessions as well, and kind of like an apprentice model. You've heard a lot of talk earlier today and elsewhere about how the mystical experience is the depth of the mystical experience is related to therapeutic outcomes. The deeper the mystical experience, the greater the benefit that people get in the treatment of addiction, in the loss of fear of anxiety about cancer diagnosis or life-threatening illnesses. We use the same mystical experience questionnaire in the MDMA research. And people don't score as high as they do on average with the classic psychedelics, but they do score remarkably high on these measures. But what we have identified is that there is no correlation between the depth of the mystical experience and therapeutic outcomes when it comes to MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. And so I think that's a really important distinction between the use of MDMA and the classic psychedelics. And it also validates our treatment approach, which is we're not trying to steer people to a mystical experience. If that happens, that's good. There may be other benefits, but what we're trying to do is just support whatever is emerging. So I think this is a key finding, and these are from 2 different of our phase 2 studies. Now, what I'm about to share is the results of our phase 3 studies. And these have taken place starting, 2016, we had the meeting with FDA, November 29th, 2017. We negotiated all of the designs that we need to do, and then 2018 is when we started the first phase 3 study. And I'll tell you about our confirmatory study, which we just released some of the results last week. So this is kind of one of the first public presentations about our second phase 3 study. Now, the first one we published here in Nature Medicine. The results were pretty remarkable. We got a lot of PR. We feel that the public opinion, the public education is really essential. because it was the fear of the public about psychedelics that caused psychedelic research to be blocked all over the world for decades. And so you can have all the science in the world, but if the general view is that these drugs are fearful, that they're delusionary, that they're dangerous, then that will overwhelm the science a lot of times. That will motivate the politicians, overwhelm the science. So public education is really key, and bipartisan support is also essential. And so far we have managed to take psychedelic research to be one of the few things in America that is not caught in the culture wars. And I think that we're going to continue to do that, and a lot of that is because of the work with veterans, the work with police officers, this idea that this is for everybody. So we really focus a lot on public education. Sorry for this cut off, but this is our phase 3 design that Eric showed as well. It's 3 MDMA sessions with 12 90-minute non-drug sessions as well. And we went to the FDA and we said, my dissertation was about the FDA regulation of psychedelics and marijuana. And one of the key issues is the double blind. And I had thought that I had solved the double blind problem, and what it was going to be therapy with full dose MDMA versus therapy with low dose MDMA. So everybody would be told you'd get MDMA, everybody's expectations are the same, and the challenge was going to be to find the dose of MDMA, the low dose, that was high enough to cause confusion, but not so high that you got all this therapeutic potential that would make it difficult for us to tell the difference between the groups. And so as a result, we studied 0, inactive placebo, 25 milligrams, 30 milligrams, 40 milligrams, 50 milligrams, 75 milligrams, 100, 125, and 150. As it turned out, as it often does in research, that your hypotheses are wrong. So luckily, I got my PhD, and then we realized I was wrong. But what it turned out is that the low doses of MDMA, when we added them to therapy, they did cause a certain amount of confusion. That part was right. But it made people uncomfortable, the low doses. So it's like turbulence in an airplane where you're just taking off. You know, it's a little bit difficult at the beginning, and then if you get enough of a dose, then it can be, you get over the clouds and it's kind of smooth sailing. So what we showed is, in our phase 2 studies that we did for 16 years, starting 2000 to 2016, that the people who got therapy without MDMA did better than the people who got therapy with low-dose MDMA. So that it would be easier for us to tell a difference between the two groups if we used therapy with low-dose MDMA versus therapy with full-dose MDMA. And so we went to the FDA and we said there is no solution to the double-blind problem, at least when it comes to MDMA, because we also found that the effective dose of MDMA was lower than we thought. A 75 milligram dose group was very effective in one of our earlier studies with veterans, firefighters, and police officers. So we said to the FDA, we will let you tell us how to do this study. If you want us to give you a double blind, we will. And they said, they thought about it, and they said, no, it's more important that we make it harder for you to tell a difference between the two groups. And there's another advantage for using inactive placebo, which is that whatever safety problems come up in the control group, we know are now due to the therapy in this patient population. We can't say, oh, this is maybe due to the low dose of MDMA. So we have a better comparison of safety and a harder task to show a difference by using therapy with inactive placebo. And so the FDA agreed with that. And what they said is that in practice, in research, a lot of times, the double blind is a theory, but it doesn't work in practice because the side effects from a lot of the drugs, like SSRIs, have a lot of side effects, sexual side effects and mood side effects. And so when people report their side effects, a lot of the researchers can tell which group people are in. So what the FDA said is there's 2 main ways to reduce experimenter bias when you don't really trust the double blind to be that effective. And the first one is random assignment. So what that means is that everybody is screened and enrolled. They're all willing to go through either therapy with MDMA or therapy with inactive placebo. And then the other part is this here, this independent raters. What we need is raters who are blind to the condition of whether the subject was in one group or the other. And so we actually have a pool of independent raters who administer the CAPS, the clinician-administered PTSD scale, trained by the Veterans Administration. That's where the CAPS was initially developed. And there's over 20 of them, and they do inter-rater reliability tests by watching a videotape of the therapy session to calibrate so the raters are all similarly using the measures. And then they're randomly assigned to whichever patient needs the next assessment. So the raters often only see each patient one time. They don't track them through the study, and they don't know which group they're in. So that's the methodological response to the challenge of the double blind, and that's how we do these studies. And so because we found that the low dose, 75 milligrams, worked much better than we thought, the first session is going to be 80 milligrams. The reason we went from 75 is just financial. It costs millions of dollars to do different dose forms and all the stability, so we use 80 and 120 milligrams. So we just have 40 milligram capsules and 60 milligram capsules, and we can mix and match. And otherwise, if we use 75, we would have had 37 and a half and 125. So the first session is 80 milligrams, and then we believe that longer is better. You heard Ben talk about trying to develop a shorter acting MDMA, that maybe that works better in the National Health Service or something, and that's worth exploring. But our view is once you get into this optimal zone of arousal, the longer time that you're in it, the better. And so we intentionally, 2 hours or so, 1.5 to 2.5 hours after the initial dose, we give half the initial dose to prolong the session, intentionally to make it longer, so that people can do more work. And a lot of times people will come up against something that's kind of very painful, and they'll be a little bit resistant, and then they'll sort of push it away for a moment, and then maybe an hour or two later it comes back. And so we also find that as the drug is tapering off near the last 5, 6, 7 hour, 8 hours time, people do a lot of really important work. So about 90-95% of the people opt for the supplemental dose. So the first one is 80 milligrams. Then the second is a discussion between therapists and patients. Do they want to go up to 120 milligrams followed by 60? And almost everybody does. And then the same is true for the third as well. And then we wanted this to be the primary outcome measure. We wanted it to be a long time after the MDMA session, because we didn't want people to say, oh, you're testing them a week later and that's the psychedelic afterglow, or that's not really durable. So our primary outcome measure for approval is this 2-month follow-up. But that's to get it approved. But that's not good enough for insurance companies, because this is labor intensive. So what we really need to show is that it's durable. And so we do, in our phase 2, we did a 1-year follow-up. In phase 3, we're doing 6 months or longer follow-up to show whether it's durable or not. So this is our approach. We negotiated with FDA. We had to do two 100-person studies. That's pretty small for phase 3. And the reason it's that small is because we have a large effect size. So that sometimes studies with SSRIs or other drugs that have small effect size, you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds or thousands sometimes people in studies. From a statistical point of view, the more people you have in the study, the smaller of a difference you can get reliable statistics on. So our case is terrific. We had a very large effect size in our phase 2. So we're also able to do this with 2 100-person phase 3 studies. And in the first study, COVID happened near the end of it, and we had to stop. And so we negotiated with FDA that the first study was 90 subjects, and the second one was 103. So the veterans get the most media attention, but they're not the most people with PTSD. Most people with PTSD in America are women from sexual abuse or something like that. So you can see sexual assault, sexual trauma. About 2/3 are women, 1/3 are male, but we do have a fair amount of veterans here. The terrible thing about America, is these shootings in schools. It happens in other countries sometimes as well. So we have a range of PTSD. One of the most important things that we found in phase 2 is that the therapy worked regardless of the cause of the trauma. So the SSRIs work better in women than in men, and they failed in combat-related PTSD. And we found that this worked regardless of the cause of the PTSD. So that was really good for us because we could then enroll anybody, and then if we do get this drug approved by the FDA, then it will be approved for anybody. But we also felt that in this initial studies that we need to work with the people that are suffering the most. You know, can it really help those people that are the most extreme with PTSD? And so we enrolled people who have chronic PTSD, at least 6 months. We had 1/3 of them had PTSD an average of 20 or more years. The average was 14 years. What brings down the average was more of the veterans who had been more recently traumatized in the war. But we worked in people that have really been stuck. The key thing is that many people who are traumatized were resilient. Most people will recover from PTSD. That's what Eric's slide showed as well, that most people will recover, were resilient. And if you have chronic PTSD defined at least 6 months, then you're not likely to get better unless there's some intervention. So the natural healing process is not going to be taking place in these people. And we, unlike some PTSD studies, we felt that we would enroll people who had previously attempted suicide, if that had happened. They couldn't be actively suicidal right at the moment to be enrolled, but they could have had a history of suicide attempts or suicidal behavior. We showed over 90% had positive ideation for suicide, over 1/3 serious ideation, and a little bit less than 1/3 in some, about 1/3 had positive behaviors. And what that means is that you either actually attempted to kill yourself, or you went to a bridge and you thought about jumping off, but you didn't do it. So again, what we're trying to say is that we wanted to test the therapy against the people that are suffering the most, and we also wanted to do the best for the patients, not necessarily thinking about the economics of it. That's why we have a 2-person team. That's why there's a 3-session model. It's how do we maximize therapeutic outcomes? How do we show what's the best that we can do? These are the results here. The thing that I'd like to show you here is if you look at the distance between this group, this is the therapy with placebo, this is therapy with MDMA. And this is after the first session, after the second session, and after the third session. So in this particular study, the distance grew after each session, so that it means there's a compounding effect of each additional MDMA session. So we will never make this, for serious, severe PTSD, this is not a 1-session model. So I think one of the big mistakes of the 60s was this idea that psychedelics are a miracle cure. And you take 1 dose and now you're enlightened and everything's fine for the rest of your life and you don't have to do integration and you're smarter than everybody else. And that was Timothy Leary's approach. But what we're showing here is that there's a cumulative effect of subsequent sessions. And what we find is that a lot of the people go deeper on the second session than on the first. The first, you're building the therapeutic alliance. You're getting to know your own self under the influence of MDMA. You're learning what it does. You're learning that you can release your emotions. Like the video that Eric showed of the fellow crying under the LSD therapy, that you're learning how to manage this situation. And so people tend to go deeper on the second session. And some people need more as well. So there's a statistical method called effect size, which is designed to compare different treatments and different studies against each other, even if they're not direct head-to-head comparisons. And so an effect size of 1 means it's 1 standard deviation from the norm. And so the FDA will approve drugs with a small effect size in here, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4. Now, you also have to have 2 successful phase 3 studies to apply to the FDA to get your drug evaluated. And pharma companies can do as many phase 3 studies as they want, they just have to have 2 successful ones. And in the past, pharma companies would never publish the results from their failed phase 3 studies. And that's why we have clinicaltrials.gov right now, where pharma companies have to put up on the web every study that they're going to do so you can see the percentage of failed studies versus the percentage of successful studies. And so Zoloft succeeded in 2, but you can see small effect size. Paxil failed here, but had 2 successful here. But then our first study was really a large effect size. And there's 2 different ways to think about effect size. And the classic way is called placebo subtracted. You subtract the results from your test group from the placebo group. But in our case, the placebo is therapy, and the therapy is actually quite effective. So when we're subtracting the placebo group, we're subtracting out the therapy, we're leaving just the effect of the MDMA. And so that's still 0.91. That's a really remarkable effect size. But when we look within subjects to the people that get therapy plus MDMA, it's 2.1 effect size. Remarkable. So this is good evidence. We have not done direct head-to-head comparisons. We don't think that that's necessary. And it does not required by the FDA, but this gives us a sense that this is likely to be the most effective of these other conditions. Plus, of those people that were in our study, almost all of them have been through medications and been through other kinds of psychotherapies. We also look at depression. 91% of the people in our studies that have PTSD also have depression. Not unusual. We have not yet studied depression without PTSD. That might be kind of a different sort of depression. So how well it works, maybe there's a biological component to that or something like that. So we can't say that yet that this is good for depression, but it reduces depression in people that have PTSD, again, like this, and then also functional impairment. And I think this is really key for what the patients are looking for. They want to get back to life. They want to get back to work. They want to be able to leave their homes. They want to do all sorts of things and without being triggered by their PTSD. So we show substantial and dramatic increases in decreases in functional impairment, increases in functional error. Okay, now I skipped over a slide before just to say this, that our statistical significance. So you have to have 0.05, which means a nickel out of a dollar. It means 1 in 20 chance that it's random. It has to be 0.05 or less statistics so that that it's not a random finding. And what we had was 0.0001, which was 1 in 10,000 chance that our study was random. Our results were random in the first study. And so the results that we had were really remarkable in that 32% of the people that got the therapy with inactive placebo at the 2-month follow-up no longer qualified for a diagnosis of PTSD. So that's really good. And what we're doing is we're trying to show that the therapists themselves are actually, they can tell almost all the time, not all the time. Around 10% of the time, there's a little bit of confusion. Did somebody really get the MDMA or not? So it's not completely transparent, but the therapists are trying as hard as they can whether people get MDMA or not. And what we see is that 32% no longer have PTSD at the 2-month follow-up in the therapy with placebo group, but 67%, more than twice as many with the MDMA. And then another 21% had what's called clinically significant reductions in PTSD symptoms. That means that their life has been changed, they have lower symptoms, they still have PTSD, but they're able to function better. And then over time, they might get better on their own, or if they could have had a 4th session. So we had 88% responders, 12% non-responders. So the important thing to say is it doesn't work for everybody. It's not a miracle cure. There were 12% of the people that were in our study that did not respond. Now in phase 2, where we had combined those people that had MDMA with inactive placebo or MDMA with low-dose MDMA, trying to find if it would work for a double-blind, we had 23% no longer had PTSD at the 2-month follow-up. At the group that had MDMA plus therapy 54%, and here was the 1-year follow-up. And this is what we're really waiting for here. But the 1-year follow-up showed that people get better over time. Not only is it durable, but we have taught people how to process trauma, that you don't need to run away from your memories, that you can work with these memories, you can let out your feelings, you don't have to be overwhelmed, and people get better on their own. Now, it doesn't mean that this is only due to the MDMA. People have gone back to therapy, some have gone back to medication, some have done various different kinds of things, but the net result is that in our phase 2 studies, people continued to get better after the therapy was over. And that's really important. We're really trying to help people understand that they are the agent of their improvement, that they have the capacity to heal themselves, that we're not doing it to them, they are doing it themselves with the aid of the therapy, with the aid of the MDMA, but they can continue to do that on their own. And so in the next couple months, we will get the 1-year follow-up data or the 6-month or longer follow-up data from our first phase 3 study. So that's still unavailable, but we're eagerly looking forward to it. Now, this is a remarkable slide. One of the strategies when people are traumatized is to dissociate. It's like you're not there. You know, that this is happening to your body, but it's not happening to you. But that's because it's so painful what's happening. And so when you do this dissociation, when you come back to it, then it's even more difficult. And so the dissociative subtype are those people that are high on this, removed from their own experience, removed from their own emotions. And so what we showed here is that the people on the dissociative subtype actually had more of a decline from the PTSD than the average from everybody else. So this works best in the hardest cases. And I think what that means is that these people are so hungry to be connected, they're so in need of somehow or other connecting to their own experience, that once that happens, they make rapid progress. So this was really a remarkable finding as well. Now, there were no site effects. We had 15 sites, 2 in Israel, 2 in Canada, 11 in the United States. So one of the big concerns of the FDA would be is, what if these are highly trained psychedelic therapists, that they've been involved in the psychedelic community for 20, 30 years? Is this something that we can train new therapists about? Or is this only really restricted to highly trained people that have had loads of their own psychedelic experiences and all of that? And so the way the FDA looks at this is they look at all the different sites. Are you getting most of your data from one site, and these are the best people, and the other people are contributing smaller amounts of subjects? So in order to overcome that objection, we took our most experienced therapist team, Michael and Annie Mithofer, we took them out of phase 3. And they realized that they were also getting older, that they needed to move more to train the next generation of therapists. So when we did the statistical evaluation to see whether there were any site-to-site effects, there were none. So what that means is that it's not the most experienced people driving the outcomes. It speaks to the quality of the training program, and it speaks to the therapeutic potential of MDMA. So this is what gives us hope that we want to train 25,000 therapists in this next decade. And I think that we can transmit the knowledge of our core trainers to a wider group of therapists. And this is one of the reasons why I think, because there were no site-to-site effects. Now, none of this great news that I just gave you would mean a lot if there was a terrible safety profile. So we have to look at the safety. So we have a series of non-serious, transient, treatment-emergent reported effects, adverse events, muscle tightness, decreased appetite. All of these are more in the MDMA group than in the placebo group, but they're short-lived, they're transient, they're not that serious. And, as Ben pointed out, in this morning, we don't see this low mood either in these subjects. But these are the very acute side effects. So there's a bunch, but they're easily managed. Now, what about more important side effects? With this serious ideation, we actually had more in the placebo group than in the MDMA group, and we actually had a sad situation of a woman in the placebo group tried to kill herself twice during the study. And fortunately did not succeed. And another woman had such severe suicidal ideation that she decided to check herself into a hospital to not cause self-harm. And both of these women were in the placebo group. Now, that was something that, because we had no MDMA in the placebo group, it was therapy with inactive placebo, we could say that this is due to the baseline, the background of having serious, severe PTSD and going through therapy and bringing things to the surface. The other part, and this is kind of an ethical issue that I will blame on the FDA a little bit. In phase 2, after each subject completed the 2-month follow-up, we uncovered the blind on an individual basis, and then those people could then go through the study again with MDMA. But for phase 3, the FDA said, no, we want to preserve the illusion of the double blind and make it look right, so we will only let you uncover the blind one time at the end of the study, and the study could take years to complete, and only then will the people that are in the placebo group can go through it again with therapy with real MDMA. So I think that these two people that had this one woman in particular that tried to kill herself twice, that she was in despair. She realized that she was in the placebo group, and she didn't think she could wait as long as she needed to get into the crossover study. So I think the FDA, there were some ethical issues that we were unable to persuade the FDA about that particular design. So with adverse special interests, a little bit more suicidal thoughts in the placebo group, we had no cardiovascular problems, and no abuse potential. So we don't have any reports of people becoming ecstasy addicts or whatever like that after the study. Now, MDMA only stays in your blood a couple days. It's not like marijuana that you can test it for a month or so. So we don't do blood tests. This is self-report. But in all the concerns here, okay, I see we're over time, so I will try to go a bit faster. Science declared our study the top 10 scientific breakthroughs of the year. It was phenomenal. Yeah. And I think it was both because of our great results, but also it's because it's the forerunner of all the work with psilocybin and other psychedelics as well. So while we got the award, it's really the award, I think, for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Now, this is a very important project proposed. These are two different studies that we've combined the data, but the Veterans Administration did a study that was with over 900 people, and they compared two different psychotherapies. One of them is called prolonged exposure, and the other is this one here, and the other is cognitive processing therapy. And so that took them multiple years to do this study. And so what we see is that their group started a little bit lower with PTSD symptoms, and our group had more PTSD symptoms a little bit. But in the end, what happened is that our results were the best of all. But that's not really the most important point. The most important point is the dropout rates. So that the prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy, about half the people dropped out of the study because it was too difficult for them to confront their traumas without any kind of pharmacological aid. And so this is really key, that we had a 6.5% dropout rate. And even in the placebo group, it was only 10% because they knew that they could eventually get MDMA. So I know I have to race now. So this is the results of our second phase 3 study. So this is the big news. Well, let me go back. It was successful. Okay. It confirmed the prior. Now I can't tell you the exact results because we're kind of holding them off so that we can make sure we can get it published in a scientific paper. But I can say that it was similar to the results of our first study, and fortunately in the second study we had nobody have no one tried to attempt to suicide in either group at all. So now we have 2 successful phase 3 studies, and the next step is to give you a sense of what our timetable is. Okay, just to show you the timetable is we hope that we're now done. We're going to submit to Q3 here. We submit everything to the FDA. It takes us a bunch of time to do that. And we think FDA approval is going to be here, Q2 of 2024. We think DEA has 90 days to reschedule, and states have to reschedule as well. Half the US states automatically do it, the other half have various mechanisms. We're working there. And then the launch will be Q4. And then 1 year later is where we reach sustainability. So that's where we're at right now. And I think I will, let me show one more thing. Sorry here. But this is important because I want to talk about how we're thinking this should become a medicine. And so, as I've said before, and I've tried to emphasize multiple times, that it's therapy. It is therapy. It's not the psychedelic. It's the therapy that the psychedelic makes more effective. So what we're wanting to say to the FDA is that once this becomes approved, the only people that can give it actually to patients are going to be therapists that have been through the training program where they've learned the therapeutic method that we've used in phase 3 studies. So we want it to be prescribed only by prescribers that get special training. They only need 2 to 4 hours of training just for the medical complications, the increase in blood pressure. That's the main thing, and certain other exclusion criteria. Then the therapists have to go through training. Now, we don't want to be the only one that trains it. What we want is schools of psychiatry and psychotherapy to offer this training to their students. This should become standard, and they should be trained not just MDMA, but they should be cross-trained with ketamine, with psilocybin, with all the psychedelics. So we want to bring forth psychedelic training. And that's why it's a public benefit corporation. We're not just trying to sell MDMA to people. We want to make it to be psychedelic psychotherapy, and we want to empower the therapists to be able to do that. But there's other therapeutic methods than ours also. There's prolonged exposure. We are funding studies now to combine MDMA with cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, which is couples where one person has PTSD, it affects the relationship. We're funding MDMA with other therapeutic modalities. So once somebody has been through our training program or a training program that we authorize, then post-approval, we want them to be able to design a customized treatment and use whatever other tools they want to use. We're not going to do the adherence ratings post-approval. And so, and then we'll figure out how are we going to supply this directly to the healthcare providers? Are we going to provide it to the patients? But this is the negotiations called REMS, Risk Evaluation Mitigation Strategies. So that's, we're also going to Europe. And if we get EMA and FDA approval, we can get it approved all over the world. And the biggest goal for us, and this I'll be done, is just to say that we want a world of net zero trauma by 2070. So for a long time, our goal was just how do we get this as a medicine? Now it looks like we have a very good chance to make MDMA into a medicine. So now we're thinking we need mass mental health, we need a spiritualized humanity. We want to try to make it so that I think over the next 20 or 30 years it's going to be harder for humanity. There's estimated 1 billion climate refugees by 2050 potentially. We want to work in prisons. We want to do stuff with the Minister of Justice here. And we want to have a spiritualized humanity, mass mental health, and net zero trauma by 2070. Thank you. Thank you.